Well, Bashar al-Assad is the sort of bloody tyrant who might have been drawn by Shakespeare, or Macbeth, Richard III, or Titus Andronicus. On the eve of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, we're reflecting this week on Britain through the writings of 3 British authors. There being no better place to start than at the top, we begin with Shakespeare on the question of leadership. What is it? What does Shakespeare have to tell us about it? And do we care for it any longer? In a moment, 2 of our leading actors and one of the country's foremost historians will try to answer those questions. First, though, Stephen Smith has this.
Be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them.
Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown.
Men of few words are the best men.
The smallest worm will turn, being trodden on.
When we're not out on the street calling for our leaders to depart the stage at the first available opportunity, we're indulging in other colourful traditions of our island story, like celebrating the anniversary of a popular sovereign coming to the throne. Who'd be a leader at the mercy of our whims and appetites?
By being seldom seen, I could not stir, but like a comet, I was wondered at.
What you're doing at the beginning is nice, but
Sir Richard Eyre has been directing Henry IV as part of a Jubilee season of Shakespeare plays for the BBC.
OK, one more, folks.
All Shakespeare's become proverbial. It's there, thank God, as part of the DNA of British life.
Sketch writers, voters, we often see politicians in Shakespearean terms. Do you think they do themselves?
I think most of them aspire, and it's not a very close reading of the play, to Henry V.
We few. We happy few. We band of brothers.
It's the exemplary piece of political rhetoric. I think they all see themselves at, party conference, standing up and, rousing the troops in that way.
We are Conservatives. We will speak of pride, of honour, of valour in battle, and yes, of glory.
The voice of the real people with real needs is louder than all the boos.
Education, education, and education.
But as with Henry V, it's quite cynical, and it doesn't solve the problem of how to govern. And how to govern is the constant preoccupation in play after play after play of Shakespeare's. It's how do you manage a society that has internal dissent. Shakespeare is brilliantly perceptive about the virus of power. The laughable in British politics, it's always in the House of Commons, you see aggressive opposition. That's absolutely endemic.
If we listened to the muttering idiot sitting opposite me...
I'm taking the Shakespeare Way, which goes from Stratford to London and passes through Chipping Norton. It's been one of the most important centres of power in the country, home to David Cameron and his influential friends.
The whole Chipping Norton set thing is so interesting because it's something that would have been unremarkable 50 or 100 years ago, when Harold Macmillan was swanning around Clubland or something. Nobody thought anything of it. But now we live in this kind of populist, individualistic, democratic age where people almost slightly resent the idea that everybody at the top knows one another and there's this patrician world that ordinary people are shut out of. I think the whole nature of leadership and the idea of leadership has actually become quite suspect. I mean, we live in a completely different sort of intellectual world from the one that Shakespeare or even somebody like Gladstone inhabited. So we live in an age of, universal literacy, mass education and so on, where your opinion is as good as the next man's. You're not going to be talked down to and led, that kind of ethos. makes it hard for somebody to stand up and to say, I will be the leader, you know, I will guide you.
The Shakespeare Way runs, some say wends, from Chipping Norton to Oxford. Of course, David Cameron travelled in the opposite direction. But in common with many of today's frontline politicians, he likes to downplay his prestigious education, preferring instead to advertise his taste for a humble snack, which was around in Shakespeare's time. In search of further clues about Shakespeare and leadership, I've come to the historic city of Oxford, to a hallowed spot forever associated with the bard and absolutely steeped in his writings. It's just above a bookmaker's. Believe it or not, this was once a hotel room, and the Swan of Avon himself stayed here. Scuffed and partially hidden behind a sliding panel, these walls are thought to be largely unchanged since his time. Shakespeare bedded down here with the common man and woman. He understood that their desires couldn't always be indulged by a good leader.
Leadership is sometimes about being uncompromising. At other times, it's about a dialogue. I'm very struck in the case of David Cameron that he has this extraordinary valuation of friendship, that he will stand by his friends whatever happens. But an essential part of leadership has to be being a good butcher. Henry V is a good butcher. If it comes to it, he chooses the right course for his country, even if that means betraying, destroying his friends.
This is London. And so is this.
In the Second World War, another leader who understood the rallying power of Shakespeare's prose commissioned this famous version of Henry V from Laurence Olivier.
Once more, unto the breach, dear friends!
Prime Minister Churchill wanted to inspire the troops serving on D-Day. The film was even dedicated to them.
Cry God for Harry! England and St. George!
And motivation, when it works, is like an adrenaline shot. It pumps people up. So that at the end, when he says, cry God for Harry, England and St. George, they're saying, let's go.
Olivier's son, Richard, uses the same ringing oratory to teach management skills to business leaders.
Many leaders, in our experience, on day 90 of the campaign, given Henry's situation, do not say once more unto the breach. They come in with a very detailed report of the key performance indicators of the first 3 months of the siege. Human beings need a sense of meaning and purpose, and leaders who can tell a good story and hold that meaning for us.
There does seem to be a contempt for leaders. Can Shakespeare help them and help us out of it, do you think?
I mean, I'm biased, but I think Shakespeare can guide us through pretty much anything if you find the right play and look at it in the right way. There is that absolute sense in people that we want better leaders. And unfortunately, I would probably also say we tend to get the leadership we deserve. So what are we not doing? What are we not developing in our leaders? What permission are we giving them to be greedy or rapacious? Who's rewarding them?
The good news for today's politicians is that they rarely have to settle their differences as they did in Shakespeare's plays, and the worst they have to fear is a clash of personalities.
Well, Mark Rylance, as well as starring in the smash hit Jerusalem, has played more Shakespearean characters than most of us have had hot dinners. He's here with fellow actor Tom Hiddleston, who's just finished shooting a new production of Henry V, and the historian Simon Sharma, whose latest TV series, Shakespeare and Us, is broadcast next month. What do you think Shakespeare teaches us about leadership, Mark?
I think the one thing he does remarkably is that they're all human beings, and he so loves opposites that even in a character like Richard III, he gives him a remarkable speech of conscience. Macbeth as well has a remarkable speech of conscience. Henry V, which you're playing, Tom, is a very responsible leader, but there are two plays before where he's most incredibly irresponsible. doing the equivalent in my mind of taking ecstasy and going out every night clubbing. He shows this humanity, and I wonder if we expect our leaders to be perfect in all fields. A leader in another area, like Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing, who's a totally chaotic village constable, actually solves the plot. He actually finds through ineptitude the evil that's going on. And is it right to, I've been thinking, is it right to expect our leaders to be very strong in every area? If we'd known about if Martin Luther King had been alive now, under the scrutiny of the press now, and we'd learnt about his infidelities and his behavior, would he have ever got to the Capitol and made that speech? Would we be better off to have known everything about him and rejected him as a leader?
This question of the humanity, the person is not only the office, but they are a human being, is something, as Mark remarks, that has been until very recently something that it's very hard for people to deal with.
Well, it was an issue for the Elizabethans, because the Queen, actually, Elizabeth I, very unusually, in the Tilbury speech, for example, her entire authority was predicated not on her remoteness, but actually the illusion, at least, that she was one of everybody else. So already that dilemma, how do you actually be familiar and yet august? And those two kind of role models endlessly grinding against each other goes right through Shakespeare all the time, because he actually lived in both worlds. He's an actor, he roughs it a bit where he lives, but he also plays before the court.
And, I mean, you've just played the most inspirational leader of the lot, really, Henry V.
I have indeed, yeah. The interesting thing about Henry V is it dramatises that tussle between the irresponsibility of public office and the private, almost torment of personal accountability very well. One of my favourite lines from the play is when, on the eve of Agincourt, Henry V, disguised under the cloak of one of his captains, gets into a debate with a private soldier about kingship and responsibility, and this character, Williams, is casting various aspersions about it'll be a black matter for, when all those arms and legs chopped off in battle say they died at such a place, it'll be a black matter for the king that led them to it.
If the cause is not just. Yeah.
And Henry's response is, every subject's duty is the king's, but every subject's soul is his own.
Now, how do you think, I mean, you've just played it now for this BBC series. Did you think about how the mood of the times made it a different sort of person you were portraying to, for example, Olivier there in 1944?
Yes, I did. There's no way I was ever going to match or compete with Olivier's portrayal, I think. I think because Thea Sharrock and I discussed this a lot, in that I think our society, we don't trust rhetoric in the same way, and we're all used to seeing...
This is interesting, because Dominic Sandbrook, in that piece there that Stephen Smith, talking about society now, we are not willing to indulge a belief in the magical properties of leaders in the way that perhaps some previous generations were, or we think they were. Do you get that
But also
sense?
previous generations, I should just say, the thing about Henry V which distinguishes him from contemporary leaders is that the men and women in the highest positions of power were also the men and women physically leading their armies to battle. So Henry V is able to give that speech and jump on a horse and ride into battle himself. So in a way, there's an authenticity to that kind of rhetoric, which is...
The issue of rhetoric is very tricky, because actually I live in America most of the time, and whether or not Obama's rhetoric, who is a master rhetorician, is an asset or a liability. It was seen as a great asset in 2008. Some people are, but we don't know. He's got the ability to produce rhetorical rabbits from the hat. Rhetoric does change power. Churchill's rhetoric in May 1940 changed what the cabinet said it would do. It's in Shakespeare's own time that regular kids in village grammar schools were taught books of rhetoric. Thomas Wilson's The Art of Rhetoric, Henry Peacham's The Garden of Eloquence. You could be really quite ordinary person from a lower middle class background and suppose that you would not actually get through school unless you really spoke. This is why my dad, when I was 9, forced me to do the Harfleur speech standing on a chair in my mother's lounge, as we called it.
I never did that, did you? No.
That's why you're actors and I'm not.
It's harder to be a leader. I mean, we live in a very, very different time now when people are much more solipsistic. They're much more inclined to make their own judgments about more or less everything. We've become a more difficult people to lead, haven't we?
You know, I always think, Jeremy, when I was a young man, I used to drive too fast sometimes, and people would tell me, slow down, and I wouldn't. But one day I was driving too fast in Kent, and someone in the back, a young woman, said, look, I had an accident 6 months ago. Would you please slow down? Because it's frightening me. And I slowed down, because she spoke from experience. And so many, like that wonderful quote and that wonderful scene, that these leaders were able to go amongst the people and get experience. Not like Diana and Fergie going out to have a party, but you think of the Duke in Measure for Measure. So many of the Rosalind and all these princesses are able to go into a situation in disguise and find out about it truthfully, and then they learn from that, or they're able to actually live very wildly, as Henry V does.
Yeah.
Part of his skills comes because he goes through experiences which now would probably mean that we wouldn't elect him to be a leader.
He understands who he's leading.
Because of the rough experiences that he goes through.
The fact is that I don't want to be harp on the Virgin Queen, but what the hell, why not? She's the only one who's done it, actually. She did go on Progress, and of course she did this in great carriages, trundling along, surrounded by courtiers. But she had the common touch. You know, when there was a little geezer in Warwick at that Progress, actually, who couldn't barely get the words out of greeting to the Queen. She said, "Come hither, little alderman," or whatever his name was. She absolutely, whatever it was about her, that's never happened since in that way. She was taught by a tutor who actually taught her rhetoric. It's a very, very hard thing to pull off.
When I came into the profession, I had a real aversion to actors who sang Shakespeare. And I think it goes hand in hand with the kind of rhetoric that people do believe. In the case of someone like George Bush, I can't even put a sentence together. The man can't be pulling the wool over our eyes, over our ears, because he can hardly speak. That's a form of reverse rhetoric that convinced a lot of people that he was
authenticity, indeed, yeah.
But eloquence, the meaning in the dictionary is to speak in such a way as affects the mind and moves the emotions with force, fluency, and appropriateness.
Wow.
And appropriateness is the really remarkable thing that I think it's hard for politicians for speakers, not just politicians, but leaders of corporations, your manager in your shop, to learn, unless you learn it through experience.
Do you, as people very familiar with the text, when you hear politicians speaking, there was a clip of Michael Portillo there, there were a couple of other things. I mean, do you detect the resonances of Shakespeare in the way that our political leaders behave?
Sure.
But it's interesting that Richard Eyre very rightly said that often Henry V is quoted with a rather lazy reading of the play. The play itself is an incredibly brutal, shocking, violent piece of work, examining the nature of warfare through the eyes of one man as he experiences it. And the Crispin's Day speech on the morning of Agincourt happens as a result of, it comes out of a personal spiritual despair. He's absolutely on the brink, Henry, and he has nothing left. His men are dying of starvation and dysentery. And they're going to lose.
Well, it's an amazing piece of pragmatic genius because he turns the weaknesses into strength. Said, Christ, we're outnumbered, we few, we happy few. And then the second stroke of genius is actually to say, he who is with me will be my brother. The illusion that you're democratically promoted by sharing your wounds
Not
with
just
the king.
He who's with me, but
that is total political genius, really.
Do you think the modern equivalent of that is the sort of mock demotic that our politicians very often affect now?
Alas, it is. But it is partly because Shakespeare had so many lives. I don't know if you think that he was a fantastic listener in the pub. It wasn't like, an Etonian chomping on a pasty for the sake of effect.
Steady.
Whoa.
We've got one here.
Hold my hands up.
But he actually... He lived that kind of raw, he had a voice for the gutter in a way which didn't need to be forced. So when he would deploy it in the plays, it had some credibility.
But Shakespeare
to it,
also
I think.
he had.
Mark, sorry, come on.
No.
Do you think-
I was only making
I thought you were just making faces for fun.
Yeah, I'm an actor.
I thought you wanted to speak.
No, you wanted to say something.
Quickly, come on.
Well, no, only that Shakespeare had enormous empathy, compassion, and wisdom about not just the man of the gutter, but about every man. And that's why he's so extraordinary. Is he's able to think himself and feel himself into the hearts and minds of an entire people, so that kings and queens are represented seemingly truthfully, as are, you know, men of the gutter, Falstaff and Mistress Quickly and Doll Tearsheet.
Okay, thank you all very much, thanks. Now, on tomorrow's programme, we'll consider what Charles Dickens has to tell us about modern-day Britain with the help of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams.